Welcome, everyone. Welcome. Nice to see a full house of munching. All right. Munchkins. When Fernando came to Austin in 2009, he invited me for a beer at Cactus Cafe and asked me what I thought he should do in order to succeed here at UT. Part of the advice I gave was to make Latin America the focus of his scholarship, which is the focus of his scholarship, something important at the school. 8 years later, he published a reference book on Latin American modernism, which was a Hamilton Book Award runner-up in 2015, organized an exhibition that toured 24 cities and counting, edited 5 books, including our very own Center 20, Latitudes 2, which he did with Kevin, and one that just won the CICA, which is the UIA Committee of Critics, honorable mention. The last time he was here giving a lunch forum, he talked about street protests in Brazil, and that research became the manuscript for a new book that will be published by UT Press next year. Since the Center Lunch Forum worked so well for him.
It does. No, only for me.
He is back with a new proposal that he hopes to turn into yet another book. I think it's time to have another beer and tell him to slow down. Thank you, Fernando.
Thank you, Marshall. So, pleasure to be here. I think it's my third time in those 8 years. And it is indeed a very fruitful forum for engaging those ideas and turning ideas into real projects. I mean, it worked really well for my last project, and just became a manuscript that I delivered to UT Press. But a lot of what I do is inspired by this map. I drew this map some 15 years ago when I first came to the University of Michigan. I got 4 of the major books about modern architecture published in English. Kenneth Frampton, Vincent Scully, William Curtis, and the modern architectural part of Spiro Kostoff. And then I put a little dot on the map for every building mentioned, right? Every building mentioned, those 4 books coded by color, have a dot on the map. And the result, it's not explicit, it's photographic, right? I coined a term for that. It's called NATO-centrism. Yeah, I think I invented that term. I'm trying to figure out if anybody used that term before. It's no coincidence that the planet has been safeguarded or controlled by a military alliance after World War II called the North Atlantic, NATO. And our architectural scholarship shows that really, really, really well. Some of the voids, some of the things missing in this map are just outrageous, right? Prague, Budapest, Moscow, slightly mentioned, the whole California, Mexico, there's almost nothing. The most important center of modern architecture in the Americas. And then it goes south of the Tropic of Cancer and forget it. It doesn't exist. So there's something there that needs to be addressed, right? There's something there that we need to discuss more, we need to be aware, we need to talk about. So that has guided my scholarship in the last decade or so. First with the writing of this book with Luis Carranza, the book that covers the entire 20th century, the entire Latin America. The book became an exhibition. UT was very generous to help me put the exhibition together, and it premiered here in March of 2015 at the Mebane Gallery. We have lots of videos, but we also drew this timeline that we love to print in large format. Here at UT was 6 by 30 feet. Monterrey, Mexico was the largest, was 2 by 10 meters. And then other iterations of this exhibition have been in 24 cities and counting. There's 2 more coming. It's going with me to Brazil in 2 weeks, and then it's going to Cuenca, Ecuador in December. And because of all of that, and because writing is what I do, I don't have many opportunities to design. I put together with a couple of colleagues a platform. And this platform is for making books hopefully trilingual. The one Quid Novae that won an award as the best book by the Brazilian Graduate Association of Architecture, Graduate Programs Association in 2016 is the only real trilingual book that we did, Portuguese, Spanish, and English. The other ones are just bilingual. The majority of them Portuguese and English. One of them, 2 weeks ago, won an honorable mention on the SICA Awards, the UIA Critics Award, that Vincent also won a prize with an exhibition that same round. So this is what I've been doing, just to recap. And there's something that, that I've been trying to engage with. What are the Americas? To be very sincere with you all, and to respond to Michael's advice from 8 years ago, I'm not totally comfortable with being a Latin Americanist. Because there's something about the Americas that I think is very interesting and we haven't explored it yet. So I'm trying to look at that from a variety of angles. For instance, when we compare Gini coefficient is the way to measure inequality in national economies. That's the way that most scholars in the United Nations use to measure inequality. So sometimes we look at North and South, or developed and developing in countries, etc., and we discuss things like Gini coefficient, inequality. But why not look at the Americas? The Americas are very unequal, with the exception of Canada, which, by the way, at the OCDE, Canada is the 4th most unequal of all the countries. The only other more unequal than Canada in the OCDE are also from the Americas, in order the US, Mexico, and Chile. So the Americas are very unequal. So why is that? What's the source of that? Where's this tradition coming from? And of course I have lots of clues. The Americas are also very violent. If you compare the Americas with other parts of the world, even North Africa, the Americas are more violent in general. In the urban, and I could go on and on. Automobile-oriented cities, suburbanization, there are lots of issues that pertain to the Americas. And then one that I like a lot, of course, we should like a lot. The Americas are happier with all those problems, inequalities, violence, lack of sustainability of our cities. The Americas are happier than the rest of the planet. So there is something there. What is it? So what I did in the last few years, I teach a signature course that I just taught now, an hour ago. And signature courses are for the first year undergraduates, for the freshman cohort, and they are an amazing way of the School of Undergraduate Studies to bribe us to teach freshman students. So I do that. I accept their bribery, and I teach this course to them about the cities in the Americas. And because of that, I've been trying to compile a list of authors that have written about the spaces of the Americas. Because we have a very strong and defining contradiction in our discipline. Now I'm talking about architecture as a discipline, architecture and urbanism as a discipline. We believe that space matters. We believe that space forms us as much as we form space. We believe that we are shaped by our spaces. Nonetheless, 90% of our knowledge comes from another continent, or 90% or more. Of the authors that I talked to you about on the major books, look at the major books about modern architecture. Large majority of them are British. What is it? What's going on with our continent, in our discipline, that we borrow so much from Europe? There's a colleague in the University of São Paulo. I just taught this seminar at the University of São Paulo, so I will quote them a lot. I taught there in June. And one of the professors who invited me there said something that was very powerful to me. He said, Fernando, the Western civilization is fundamental. It's fundamental, it's us. We are the result of the Western civilization in different degrees, but we are. It's fundamental, but it's insufficient. It's, at this day and age, we cannot rely only on the Western canon as it was weaved together in the last 300 years. Because we also need to understand that the Western civilization as we know it is a construction. There are lots of pieces weaved together to create this body of knowledge, and lots of pieces left out. And we have examples of those exclusions throughout the history, and the map that I started with, the map of modern architecture concentrated in the North Atlantic, is one more evidence of that. There's a lot left out. So we need to engage that construction and open it up for other possibilities, for other narratives, for other paradigms that will make our built environment knowledge better. So this is the first map ever drawn of the Americas in 1514. And I was talking to Kevin here really fast. It's amazing what this map doesn't show. It's amazing to look at the distortions, right? So when the Dutch cartographer drew this map in 1514, he knew something about the Gulf of Mexico. Florida somehow has some proportions there. Yucatan is completely out of proportion, no clue. They knew something about the eastern coast of Brazil, which is also kind of in proportion. The Rio de la Plata is there, the Amazon is there. And then you go to the Pacific and they know nothing. They have no idea about California, Arizona. Even Colombia and Venezuela are weirdly represented there. Peru, for the exuberance, is exaggerated. Those distortions are amazing to us. But I'm not talking about those distortions. I'm here to talk about the authors. So what I'm doing, I'm compiling a list of authors who have written about the American space. And I hope to create a book that is a kind of intellectual history, following the arguments of those authors, following their take on the American space. And today here, for our short conversation, I will talk about three authors only, the three ones on top of the list: Eduardo Viveiros de Castro, Edmundo O'Gorman, and Arturo Escobar. There are many of those authors deal one way or another with two major tragedies of the recent history of the Americas. And I'm talking recent here is like 500 years. So the history of the Americas after the encounter with the Europeans are framed by two gigantic tragedies. One, the Amerindian Holocaust. 80% of the population of the Americas died in the first century after the encounter. Between the year 1500 and the year 1600, the population dropped from 10 million to 2 million. And because there were 5 million women alive in the year 1500, it's not only 8 million people died, it's way more, because a couple of million people were born in the 16th century. Nonetheless, the population dropped from 10 million to 2 million. The other tragedy that marks the history of our spaces is slavery. Look at the amazing and not coincidental at all. 8 million people were brought from Africa enslaved to work this land. So those two major tragedies bracket the history of this place. Nonetheless, we almost never address them. It's like issues that they are hard, they are difficult to discuss, so we avoid them. So let me go back to some of those issues. Viveiros de Castro is a Brazilian anthropologist and probably the most famous anthropologist to look at pre-Columbian societies. And he developed a theory that is being tested as we speak. I mean, he developed a theory that he hoped would apply to all Amerindian societies, all the societies of the Americas. Just to recap, our continent was first populated between 20 and 15,000 years ago. The main hypothesis is that populations from Asia crossed the Bering Strait the last time that the planet has cooled, and the Bering Strait becomes a land bridge, so they crossed from there around 15 to 18,000 years ago and then populated the whole continent. There are other theories. There are theories that Polynesians came from the South Pacific, sailing from island to island, and arrived at the Pacific. People are discovering remains of Amerindians and testing by carbon tests, and they're discovering skeletons that are 20,000 years old, more than 25,000 years old. So there's lots of debate, there's lots of new evidence coming out right now to challenge those hypotheses. But let's assume that population, we, the Amerindians, not we, because my ancestors didn't come through the Bering Strait. My ancestors came from Spain and Morocco. But the continent was populated by human beings 15 to 18,000 years ago. And those societies developed at that time completely separated from the other large body of land in the planet. There's much more connection between Europe, Asia, and Africa, and much more communication there. So there is an isolation that helped create those societies here. And what Viveiros de Castro proposes is a kind of ontology, is a way of seeing the world that he thinks applies to all those societies. And then the debate goes on, because there are anthropologists that work with Cahokia in the Mississippi, close to St. Louis, or with the Southwest Pueblos, or in the Amazonian basin, or with the Mapuche in Chile. And they say, yes, it applies or not so much. But here's the theory. According to the Amerindian perspectivism, the way that those societies deal with nature is very different from our Western tradition. They basically believe that everything in the world has a potential humanness. So a little rock, it's not human at all if it is just resting on the dirt there, on the bed of the river, or under some tree or something. But if somebody picks up that rock and takes the dust away, or sand it and polish it, this rock gains humanness. And if that person decides to use that rock as a necklace in the neck, then the rock has the highest degree of humanness. And that applies to everything, from trees to become wood, to become instruments, from animals that are domesticated. That applies to everything. It also applies to animals. This part is the more controversial part, but according to Viveiros de Castro theory, animals also see us. I mean, the book is called The Look of the Jaguar, because according to them, the animals also see us as a potential jaguar or as a potential snake. So all entities relate that way. Okay, that's really interesting. It explains a lot about the Aztecs, about the Toltecs. It explains about the Yanomami in the Amazon, It explains about the civilizations of the Mississippi. But why does that matter to us? I think it matters. I propose that it matters because it changes the way we relate to nature. We have, in our Western tradition, a huge break between us and nature. And the Amerindian way of looking at things bridges that, that gap, allows nature to become humanized. And we have all kinds of conversations about how traditional societies have a better relationship with nature, has a better understanding of Mother Earth, etc. There you go. This is the idea. So it matters how we see this space. So that's the first one. Now, this, and of course, you see lots of people personified as animals in all of those Indian societies. All the pre-colonial societies have this animal personification, which is not so common in the Western tradition. So the second one, this one is really important. Edmundo Gorman happened to be the brother of architect Juan Gorman, a very, very important Mexican architect and painter and muralist. Edmundo Gorman wrote in 1947 a book called La Invención de América. All of us who have been through the social sciences, especially in post-colonial studies, have read Edward Said, Orientalism. It's a classic, right? Said wrote that in the mid-70s. Edmundo Gorman wrote almost the same thing 30 years later. But Said was teaching at NYU and wrote in English. O'Gorman was teaching at the UNAM and wrote in Spanish. So nobody really read O'Gorman until very recent. What is O'Gorman's main argument? The main argument of O'Gorman is that the way we were taught about European modernization and the encounter with the Americas was not the proper order of things. The way I was taught is that Europe was modernizing fast in the 15th century, and then the Portuguese started navigating. And that's just an anecdote. When I was in school, they told us in Brazil that the Portuguese entered ships 3 times the size of this room and sailed across Africa to buy spices. And I was like, really? You sailed across Africa with a very little ship, very dangerous, to buy spices? Until I went to India, I spent a month there, and I think it's totally worth it. I would enter a ship. You know, if that's the only way to get those spices, I would do it. But anyway, that's
the aristocracy wanted it.
Right, they were paying a lot of money for them. I mean, imagine, you don't have a refrigerator, you can't store meat. Or the only way to eat old meat is with cinnamon, with paprika, with saffron, pepper. Yeah. That's the only way to get your protein a week after the animal died.
Yeah.
Anyway, O'Gorman has a whole theory on the maps, on cartography, to show us how the European perception of the world evolved. This is an 8th century map of the world, right? Europe, Africa, and Asia. It's always good to point out that north is to the left of this map. It's not up, it's to the left. East is up because east is where the sun rises every day and the source of life. And west is down because that's associated to death. In Egypt, the eastern side of the Nile is associated with life. The western side of the Nile is associated with death. So we in the west are associated with death, according to this tradition.
Is that why my students always...
Right, yes. Avoid the death trap. And Jerusalem is right in the middle, right? The city that brings together the 3 main monotheist religions is right in the middle of the map. That's how Europeans and Africans and Asians perceived the world before 1492, actually before 15-something. And then a much more detailed map of the 15th century. This one is from 1482. And again, like the map of the Americas, you see what they knew well. They knew the Mediterranean really well. All the Mediterranean is in good proportion and very real according to our contemporary measurements. Then you go north in Europe, or you go south in Africa, or you go to South Asia, and then everything is distorted, everything is just a guess. And then the map of the world as we know it in the 16th century. O'Gorman has a metaphor, and his hypothesis is that it wasn't that Europe was modernizing and was ready to conquer the world and navigate and discover everything. The order of factors here is different. They were modernizing, but they were also, there were forces preventing modernization. So in 1494, that crazy Savonarola was elected ruler of Firenze, of Florence, and he decided that he should go back to the religious times of prior, and he decided to burn everything, and he burned a bunch of paintings and a bunch of books. Imagine if he had burned Alberti. Imagine if he had burned the book that Alberti had published only 20 years before. The idea of O'Gorman is that it was the encounter with the Americas, random at first, because they thought they arrived in India, and we still called our native inhabitants Indians. It was the realization of the existence of another body of land with another population that triggered modernization. So basically, O'Gorman shows that in Europe, in Italy, the center of Renaissance, there were forces competing for prominence. There were forces competing for funding, for who the Medicis and the bankers, etc., will fund. Will they fund the guys that want to go back to religious times? Will they fund Brunelleschi and Alberti and 100 years later Galileo? I mean, even the times of Galileo, much later, the competition was there. And the encounter with the Americas was the trigger that gave the scientific method a great advantage. The metaphor that O'Gorman uses is amazing. It still stands 70 years after he wrote. He said, imagine if tomorrow we encounter life on another planet. What will happen to us? We will be forced to rethink everything we believe about ourselves. And it can happen tomorrow, it can happen in 100 years, it can never happen. But what might happen if we encounter life on another planet tomorrow is what happens to the European centers of knowledge at the beginning of the 16th century. When they realized this is not India, this is not the coast of China and Japan, this is a completely different body of land with completely different societies and completely different. So that surprise, that novelty triggered a reevaluation of everything they believed and was the bigger trigger of modernity. So that's O'Gorman. And the third one is Arturo Escobar, the only one who's still alive of the ones that I'm talking about. Miguel de Castro is still alive too. O'Gorman passed away. And Escobar wrote in 1989 this book, Encountering Development. And his major point in the book is to make the point, his major issue in the book and his whole scholarship is to make the point that we cannot talk about modernization without talking about colonization. They are one and the same. And if you look at the architectural historiography, when you talk about modernization, there's almost no mention of colonization, no mention of slavery. And then, of course, I'm coming to the second greatest tragedy of our continent. The fact that 8 million Africans were sold as labor force and brought to this continent, basically to substitute the 8 million that had died 100 to 150 years before. And I forgot to mention something. I put Yard Diamond, Guns, Germs, and Steel into this conversation. Why the pathogens, why the virus and the bacteria of the Europeans killed so many Amerindians and not the other way around? Why the virus and bacteria of the Amerindians didn't devastate Seville and Genova and Venice and up to Paris in the 16th century? And the answer is density. The Europeans lived in higher density. The Europeans and the Africans and the Middle Eastern populations lived in much, much higher densities. And they were devastated by those bacteria and viruses before the 12th century, 13th century, 14th century, all those plagues that ravaged Europe as it was urbanizing at the end of the Middle Ages. So density is the trick. Again, space. Relationship between people and space and how we occupy, how we deal with space was the reason why 80% of the population in the Americas died in the 16th century, and not the same impact was felt nor in Africa nor in Europe at the other edge of this transportation hub. So colonization, slavery, those huge machines of inequalities are very much tied to the idea of modernization. And I'm trying to educate myself that every time I talk about modern architecture, and I mostly teach about the 20th century, I have to educate myself and say, so here's the architecture, here are the great buildings, here are the great guys who designed those buildings, but here is the population who built those buildings. Here are the people who actually labor those construction sites and made everything, because that's the way to put those things together, right? I mean, we can't go much longer dealing with only one part of this equation. So this is the contribution of Arturo Escobar, the really hard task of putting colonization and slavery as a component of modernization. And then I could go fast to the other authors like Walter Mignolo and his idea of Latin America, Aníbal Quijano working on the development of the American cities, and again, lots of similarities between the South American, Central American, North American cities in many issues. Octavio Paz was the Mexican identity. Thomas Jefferson, of course, who designed a system to control the space of this whole expansion of the United States. Roberto Fernandez, who wrote El Laberinto Americano, the idea of tabula rasa, and then all those ideas that we learn when we discuss the Americas, they are coming back better explained. So why did we think that the Americas were a tabula rasa, a continent open, ready for a new society to take over and control the space? Because after the 16th century, it was. You look at the early explorers, the one who went up the Amazon River in 1540, or the ones who went up parts of the Mississippi around 1570. They described huge civilizations. They wrote back to the King of Spain and the King of Portugal, saying, we didn't get close because it was too dangerous, because they were heavily armed. But from a distance, we expect that settlement to have 25,000 people, judging from the amount of smoke and the amount of light that we saw at night, etc., etc. And then 100 years later, other explorers came and saw nothing. And they said, bunch of liars, those guys, huh? They lied to the king in order to get their money back or in order to finance their next expedition, etc. No, they didn't lie. population was decimated throughout the 16th century. And everywhere, that's the story of Plymouth, it's the story of Thanksgiving, the Pilgrims, it's the story of the Amazon basin, it's the story of the Rio de la Plata, right? They founded Buenos Aires in 1520. The Indians came and destroyed that settlement. They moved to Asunción, Paraguay. They came back to Buenos Aires in 1540 and founded it again, and this time there was no resistance. It's not because they were all converted and became Christian overnight, it's because they died on this Amerindian Holocaust. So,
Of
disease. Of disease. Now, there's an author, I forgot his name, who writes about that.
Is it Charles Mann?
Charles Mann wrote 1491 and 1493, right? Charles Mann is amazing. Also, the connection with China in 1493 is amazing. It's another author who had a huge impact on me. I'll remember the name soon. It's an anthropologist. He talking about the Amerindian Holocaust, he asked, think about the 20 people that you love the most. The 20 people closest to you that you love the most. Now choose one to survive with you. All the other 19 died in the next couple of years. It goes to your gut. Clark Cardinal Pat, professor at Iowa State, wrote a beautiful book of the history of architecture in the Americas, going back to the pre-Columbian societies. Stella Nair writes about the architecture of Peru, of the Inca. Mauricio Tenorio Trillo, who taught here at UT before, is in Chicago now, writes about the Mexican identity and the Mexican diaspora. Milton Santos, Brazilian geographer, Antonio Rizerio, Marina Weisman, professor at Cordoba, very important in the 1980s. Ramon Gutierrez is still alive in Buenos Aires, Del Lopton and Frederick Turner. I mean, there are more. I mean, I can easily create a list with twice that many authors. So the thing that I bring today for us to talk about is how can we incorporate that in our conversations? How can we, I mean, it's a little bit of a crusade to put the American thought a little bit closer in weight to the European thought. And again, remembering that our Western knowledge, our Western civilization is fundamental. We can't throw it away. We can't deny that we are, look at this room here, and we are all of European descent, large majority of us. That's who we are. But it's insufficient. We need to engage with the architectural treaties of Asia that we know nothing about. I learned a few years ago in Singapore that there is a Chinese treaty of architecture from the 14th century, but it was never translated yet to this day. It hasn't been translated, so we don't know about it. So this is the quick manifesto. I will keep working on that. I will keep bringing that conversation up, and I wanted to invite you all to participate. That's it. Thank you.
The floor is open. We have a good amount of time too, so please relax and let's get rolling.
Yeah, I think it's very. I would like to take your class when you're ready to start.
You'll have to read.
Yeah. Oh, by the way, a little free ad here. I am teaching this class for the first time next spring.
Yeah. But one of the things that I keep thinking about that I thought you were going to talk about that is very related to a lot of the issues that you bring is the concept of mestizaje. Mm-hmm. The word mestizaje, just the fact that it doesn't even exist in English, an equivalent to that is really, I think, at the heart of what you're talking about, in the sense that is not sufficient. You're saying it very well. The Western culture is part of the Americas, but the thing that really defines the difference is the resultant of those Europeans coming to the Americas is different levels of mestizaje.
Mm-hmm. What is that?
That What is that? Mestizaje. So
Literal translation is miscegenation.
yes, so the notion that it still is used in English many times as mestizaje is the word in Spanish of basically saying when people of the Native Americans and the Europeans mix is a mestizo, a person that has basically blood from both the European and the Native American. And it's a concept very alien in the North American view of the world. In the Latin American is very much part of the identity of all the countries that came up after colonialism. So to different levels of real or not acceptance of that as part of the identity, the biggest difference is that Latin American countries embrace that as part of the identity of the country. Whereas in North America, well, the majority. I mean, at least in the theoretical, still the dominant, obviously the dominant classes were still the descendants of the Europeans in all Latin American countries. That's the reason of this inequality. But at least in the theoretical way of seeing themselves and seeing the message, there's an embracing of that native side. The mestizaje is very much the story that people hear in Mexico, people hear it in many Latin American countries. Not all, because there are different levels of mestizaje, right? It's different in Guatemala, in Bolivia, in Argentina, but that's the infusion of that other thing that is not enough. The European is not enough because of that, and because of the way nature has played a role. And I think that's something that
several levels of that. Felipe Hernandez, who teaches in Cambridge, loves the term transculturation, a term that was invented by Fernando Ortiz in Cuba in the 1940s to explain that. So there are different levels of that. There's the strategy of incorporating native traditions in order to reinforce your own. Like the Catholic Church did that very well. They incorporated lots of the iconography of Peru and Mexico in order to sell the Christian faith to the natives. There's that level of strategy. There's also the level of the recognition that the hybrid is better than the pure, which is something that in the arts we have not yet fully embraced. We're still looking for some level of purity on what is the pure Gothic, what is the pure modern, what is the pure post-war. I think we still haven't gone beyond the issue of purity. And when you take a biological metaphor, hybridism is better. Hybridism is better for survival of the species. So I think the issue of mestizaje comes multi-layered and needs to be discussed and needs to be debated. But my problem with mestizaje is that it's applied only to the Americas, or mostly to Latin America. So when we talk about the US, we use the term multicultural society. Why? Why one is mestizaje, the other is multicultural? And I think it comes with different value judgments that we need to elaborate more. I have a little bit of trouble trying to grasp why we use different words for very similar things. Ben, and then Juan.
I like to guess, but Benjamin goes first.
Okay, yeah. So I'm from Mexico, and so I see a problem in mestizaje in our Mexican identity. So when I was in school, so my professor said, "Oh, you are half Spanish and half Indian," and it's not true, because I don't agree with that, because we don't recognize the races that are in Mexico. Chinese in Guerrero, you can see a lot of Chinese descendants, and so the problem sometimes is that we are blind in recognizing more races and go beyond that, So I don't know, like and I read Octavio Paz and Juan Inés de la Cruz, and they all agree about this, right? So the Spanish that came to Mexico and conquered us very badly, they were not like blonde and blue-eyed. They were really different, and so we have a misunderstanding of our identity. And so I just want to bring that, because I always saw in my own identity,
Exactly.
And so many people in Mexico, like
it's a good thing to
Lebanese people, and Carlos Slim is that, So I think that we need to discuss a lot and find our.
Yeah.
I'm very intrigued. First, I remember last time you were here and you were talking about all these problems happening in Brazil, right? And there were social problems. There were, and I remember, after your presentation, there was a question that emerged from the audience saying, okay, but what is the role of the architect here? And I'm very intrigued to see what your book is about, because that was something that stuck to me, saying, well, okay, how does you make this connection relevant to us, right? And I'm having also the same feeling here, right? I mean, I'm looking at all these ideas, all this scholarship. I kind of find a connection with sociology, with anthropology, perhaps with history. And I'm having a hard time figuring out how is it that's going to be transformed or framed so we in the School of Architecture have something to talk or to discuss about. I mean, how do you see that happening?
I think it's an awareness about the history of those places. I mean, aware about those places. I mean, what is this place here that was Comanche for hundreds of years, then was Spain for 300, and then was Mexico for 40 years, and then became independent, and then became part of the United States. What is this place? What's all the components of this place? I do believe that there are a kind of a spatial memory. There's a way of dealing with the place that transcends the transfer of ownership from one dominant class to another, and that remains here. And I think we need to know it. We need to know what is this continent of ours. It's like there's a imbalance in the amount of knowledge generated. That's where I want to work on the imbalance of the amount of knowledge. For instance, can we teach history of architecture only with American examples? Is it possible? No. But a lot of people teach only with European examples. So there's a struggle there in order to fine tune the traditional knowledge that we need in order to build better. And I'm aware that it's like a pendulum, and it might go too much to one side and too much to the other, but there's an awareness that needs to improve. I mean, I think you're right to talk about the relationship between these and sociology, anthropology, history, because they are light years ahead of us on challenging those canons that came from the 19th century. No, they are way ahead of us. I think we are very late. I look at the architectural books, even books like Shin, who tries to write a global history of architecture, and I compare that with the other disciplines. I'm like, we are very late. Even art history is ahead of us.
So you see this pretty much a construction of a historiography,
construction of knowledge,
and history
that
will probably look
but this knowledge
focused on architecture, on buildings, or not.
No, I in order to make the transfer of that to the design and construction of buildings, I would probably use Howard Davis' idea of a building culture. I think the local building cultures are more inertial, so they hold more. They hold the traditions more, and they are not easy to change. So there's something there to recognize the building culture and recognize even things like form. No, is the understanding of form the same for all traditions? If you grew up in a colonia in the Rio Grande Valley, or if you grew up in Minnesota, is your understanding of form the same? I think not, and I think we need to address both. We need to engage both. Yes, you.
I came here with the expectation to hear more about space and how the different theories of space in different regions or across different periods of time would, generate certain kinds of form making or space making and so on. So I'm still waiting for that frankly.
Yeah,
And
no,
I think you know
this is the goal.
there are interesting parallel conceptions. There are people who say there are some transcultural stable phenomena, like Dagobert Frey, a Viennese guy, said in civilization there are two basic formal principles. There's a linear space and there's a static monument. The static monument is kind of the pyramid is one of the most classic example, and you'll find that across the universe. You'll find it across the world as a kind of a way of making a tune. So that's an interesting theory that there is something that unites civilization. And what you're suggesting is that there are differences, and I'd like to hear those differences. And there's one study that says that the idea of abstraction is particular to Amerindians who, through their different arts and crafts techniques have shown how things are abstracted from nature and then, treated as these kind of orthogonal shapes which hark back to whatever natural objects, natural phenomena they're trying to mimic. So I'm very curious to see whether there is indeed a kind of body of knowledge that identifies different forms of space thinking and space making. So that's
I think I
that's
agree
one
with
thing.
you.
I mean, the other thing, you're interested in the social dimension, the ethnical, and that kind of dimension. I think you could say, what is the consequence of space making and the idea of territory, and what is the consequence of the idea of ownership of territory? And that's another kind of a foundation to talking about space.
When I'm relating back to the book that I just finished writing now. When I get closer to the present, it becomes clear to me that the cities in the Americas are machines to exclude and machines to forget, in a way that we don't celebrate those memories as well. We don't know that past. The past has been made oblivious. So there's a dimension of bringing that past history of the territory in order to be aware of it. There's a dimension of looking at inequalities in space and being aware of it. But mostly I'm searching for that you just described. I'm searching for the spatial response to all those ideas. I don't have them yet. I think the one that is closer is the Amerindian perspectivism of Viveiro de Castro, because it changes the way that we understand the rest of the world. It changes the relationship between us and everything else. But that's what I'm searching. I don't have yet.
I have to say, I that is the missing piece. That as long as we talk about architecture in terms of space, or space being the machine, or in machinic terms and so forth, this will be opaque. The connection you're looking for will be opaque. And the Amerindian view, which is relational and animistic, is in fact the way to go. To understand that buildings actually have character, and to learn how to read the character of a building the way one does the character of a person or of an animal, and not suppress, as hard as we do, any form of anthropomorphism, zoomorphism, phytomorphism, all the ways that our objective view of things insists that architecture is a machine, that architecture is a device. But as soon as you relax that and you allow these other intuitions to come to the fore, then buildings start to speak. And they start to speak of their presence and their spirit. And that's a part of modern theory that is almost completely erased now. So I don't think any sort of managerial, scientific, machinic view of what buildings are is going to reveal what you're looking for.
Yeah, to me, it's the strongest of these spatial manifestations of the theories is the Amerindian perspective. but I suspect there's more.
I think that what you said at the beginning, the relationship with nature, that's the key. That's the great contribution, that can be revisited. And I think it affects the way the space is created in Native American traditions, where the elements of nature are participating in the urban concept of space, and how that the imitation as a strategy, rather than integration to nature, rather than architecture as a discipline that is a contrast with nature. That's the essence of all the Americas. Architecture is not a discipline, it's an element that integrates humans in nature. And the space that they create is about trying to reinforce that relationship. That's what is gone in the Western tradition, and that's why it can be revisited now.
Yeah, the power of Viveiro de Castro's is that his theory might apply to all the Amerindian societies.
Yeah.
So there's something that developed
It
in
actually
a
applies.
lead form.
No, it's not just animism is part of early Chinese society. It's everywhere.
Yeah.
The animistic worldview is the pre-modern worldview.
It's antiquity.
Yeah. It can be dug up everywhere.
Yeah, I think it goes the ancient Slavs.
It's what about the ancient Slavs?
Well, no, but I was thinking because of, whatever you think about the Bering Strait theory, however that shakes out, there certainly probably was migration. I think there's no question that there was some migration, across the Bering Strait from Eurasian peoples who had already some kind of culture. And the ancient Slavs, and those other people like Stravinsky celebrates in The Rite of Spring, that's essentially an animistic worldview, much like in costumes and bear heads and things like that, that we associate with Amerindians on our continent. So yeah, it's a very interesting question about is it like what's can be isolated to the American stewing pot, where there was a degree of isolation from the rest of the world. What happens, and what is actually kind of a pre-existing condition, maybe as Michael was suggesting, or other peoples that come out of a different connection to the natural world that then gets transformed later on, but. There are interesting notions there, yeah.
The other thing to answer Wilfred's question is that the idea of geometry to control large parts of the territory was another one that was tested here and manifested here. It was an idea in Europe, and you had, for instance, Santa Fe, the Spanish military camp, before attacking Granada. And they never really attacked, they suffocated Granada to submission. So the Spanish camp was the perfect Spanish breed that then, a few years later, would be applied to all the settlements all over the Americas. And so the idea of this geometric control of the territory that became Thomas Jefferson, you can trace from Alberti, from the Renaissance to the Americas and back, right? There's a loop there that takes an idea, applies it to large parts of the territory, be it the new Spanish settlement in the empty land, or not really empty, in the less dense land, because nothing was really empty. So the new Spanish city like Buenos Aires or Lima, in lands less occupied, or the grid on top of Tenochtitlan over a great city. And that idea works really well in the Americas and then becomes the urban paradigm all over the world. So those loops are the ones that I'm interested in. How do they go through here?
I think, also to follow from Juan's point, and Michael's point, to what extent are these things, like take geometry, to what extent were these fields of knowledge that people possessed prior to a cultural exchange? For instance, Machu Picchu, you see the masonry of that.
It's unbelievable.
Did it exist in Europe, that kind of quality, that kind of integrated knowledge of masonry? No. So, what is distinct of a certain area and what is a kind of a cross-fertilization. And I think to work those things, if you use the term geometry, to work those things out precisely to say what was located in a certain space, in a certain territory, as a distinct field of knowledge that was mature and as developed as it was in Machu Picchu, and what was brought in and then turned into something else. I think you have to be very careful about the kind of distinction and then to say, what can we deduce from these that had a specific effect on form making, landscape making, and so on.
This will be the last question, but thank you, go ahead.
I think to that point, it's like at the same time, Ogor Mama's writing that you have like the French structuralist Levi Strauss looking for like these universals, and I think it'd be interesting to kind of compare. I know these are all specific to the Americas, but to add in kind of what other like universal thinker or thoughts are for like structural cross humanity would be an interesting point to maybe help steer what is distinctly Amerindian rather than solely looking at, like the other thought was of trying to find universals versus distinctly American.
Yeah, there's a huge debate on Viveiros de Castro's Amerindian perspective is precisely for being too much Levi-Straussian. It's too much essentializing.
Right.
And so, yes, the whole issue of post-structuralism is behind, and post-colonialism is behind all those conversations.
Well, Fernando, thank you for a
Yeah.
wonderful hour.